1, 2, 3.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin, and if you've just joined us or you haven't had the opportunity of seeing Scéalta before, can I inform you or remind you that Scéalta is a joint production of Fáilte Fears to Hear and Féal an Phobal. And can I also thank the James Connolly Centre for facilitating our interviews. My guest today is an up-and-coming media star, and she may dispute that. She is someone who has made a career out of being in the right place at the right time and asking perhaps the questions that don't really are appreciated sometimes to be asked. So, Aoife, welcome to Scéalta.
Thank you for having me.
I have to say, Aoife-Grace Moore, it's a name of a poet. It's a beautiful name, and I know you're very into the grace part. Why is that?
I don't know. My ma really wanted to give us both Irish names, so I'm Aoife and my brother's Keelan. And the Grace thing is, they always obviously loved the song.
Grace.
It was Grace. So I think that's where it came from. But it was supposed to be my first name. But my mammy was afraid people would start calling me Gracie, and she hates Gracie. So it's Aoife-Grace now. But it was always Aoife-Grace when I was younger. No, my granddad, but it's only my granddad and my dad call me Aoife-Grace now. It's always just Aoife now.
Granddads are allowed to do all that. The Irish Examiner, a very prestigious paper, is something that is that's renowned for its historical and background in terms of journalism, in terms of the quality of journalism. You're not what I would expect to be a political correspondent to be, and I say that gratefully rather than any sense of criticism. I know your mother's idea was that you would become a lawyer, a solicitor, or a barrister. So take us through your diary.
Yeah, I think I often have thought about this, and especially this week, but I am totally and 100% a product of my environment. My uncle was murdered on Bloody Sunday, and my family were one of the founding families of the Bloody Sunday Justice campaign, and I just don't ever see how I could have done anything else. I think when you grow up going to marches and protests and meetings, and when you're brought up to question everything that the government tells you, what else are you going to do when you grow up about being a journalist? So I was always good at English, always really interested in politics, and it was actually around the time I was about 15 or 16 the film Veronica Guerin came out.
Yeah, sure.
And I remember seeing it, and I think most people would have been put off by journalism by that film, but I loved it and I thought I could do that. And I read up about Veronica Guerin, and my daddy was able to tell me about Veronica Guerin and everything that she had done. And I thought, no, that's what I'm going to do, because even though the British press in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday did not cover themselves in glory, it was the presence of the international press on the day that really bolstered the family's evidence to say, this, what the British Army are saying happened, is not what happened. So although the press very much worked against this in the days after, if it wasn't for, you know, the French and Italian photographers and journalists that were there on the day, I don't think there would have been a Savile inquiry, because we know what has happened across the north when there is no one there to document these atrocities. The British Army feel like they can get away with it.
You talk about being the product of Derry, and you speak about Derry, and I've watched some of your interviews and I've read lots of them. I have them rattling around my head, but I'm not going to quote them all, but I have them around. And it's clear that you don't just come from Derry, you love Derry. And it's also clear that you're a product of a Derry family. You know, you talk about your father and your grandfather, who I want to talk with briefly about. But you talk about, like, supper time was news time. And you just listened to the news, and your father said, you need to know what's happening in this world.
Yeah, and like, I grew up, you know, before the Good Friday Agreement. I was 7 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and the news was just always a part of our life. You know, my mum and dad aren't political. I'm the first person in my family to go to university, but my dad was always obsessed with the news. There was always newspapers in the house, and we always had to watch the news every night. UTV, 6 o'clock, we were watching the news every night. Back then, like in the 90s, like when you think back on it now, it was the most depressing half an hour of your day, because the news was always bad. It was always grim. And but it was just something that was ingrained in us. You know, my dad very much kind of impressed on us that you don't want to be ignorant about what's going on. No, you have to be clued in. And I think too, with my mammy's family and the Bloody Sunday connection, was we were always waiting on news. You know, I always remember the day Tony Blair became the Prime Minister. I remember it was primary 2, and I remember going into Mrs. McLaughlin's class and saying, Tony Blair's the Prime Minister now, and we're going to get a Bloody Sunday inquiry. Because this was what was always the talk in the house. If we get a Labour government, you know, this is what's going to happen. And but I never felt any different. And then when you come from Derry, everybody is clued into the politics. Everybody has an opinion. So it's very rare that you'll meet somebody in Derry that says, oh, I don't bother. Because Derry people are inherently political.
I've no interest.
Yeah.
The family, your own family, your mother and father killing, and you're a very, the way you speak of them, you're a very loving unit. You're very kind of, you know, with each other, as opposed to sharing a house with each other. You just have that sense. And I would be interested, you ended up going to university in Scotland. Was that hard?
I ended up in Glasgow because Glasgow was the only place. I wanted to get out of Derry. You know, when you're 17, 18, I was like, this place is too small for me. I need to get out of here. And I didn't want to go to England. I always had this notion in my head that I would go to Scotland. And my cousin was a professional footballer at the time, and he was in Glasgow. So I thought, right, well, I know one person there, and went over and lived in student halls and did all that. But I stayed in Glasgow for 7 years. I loved it, loved every minute of it. And then eventually I obviously came home. I wanted to come back to Ireland then. But yeah, that's how I ended up in Glasgow, because I knew one other person.
Were you lonely?
No, I am like... From the,
you should say for your mother's sake, yes.
When it's the same. I'd say everybody has the same sort of experience. But when I went over to Glasgow, like there was a girl who was in my class at school. She came over and she lived down the stairs from me. My first day in the halls, I met a girl from Belfast who is now still my best mate. So, and then you're 18 and you're a student loan, and I couldn't tell you the first time I slept sober in my bed, but for about 2 months.
You began journalism in Glasgow. You began kind of doing a stringer's job and covering everything and all that. Can you remember your first article?
My first article, I think, was in the Derry News when I was about 16. I did work experience in 5th year, and I got sent to the Derry News for a week, and I got sent to the cinema and had a review of film in the cinema, and that was my first byline, was in the Derry News. I still have it somewhere in the house.
Oh yes, of course.
Film's terrible.
And was it like full of intrepidation? Have I got it right? Is it too flowery? Is it too...
No, see, to be honest, I am one of these people. I just power through everything. Like, I have always felt, and my dad always says this to me, he was like, whatever job you do in your life or whatever task you take on in your life, he was like, I can guarantee you that there's a man doing that job who shouldn't be doing that job.
And he's absolutely right.
So go you in and do your best, because there's already somebody in there doing that job who's coasting. So that's the way I've always felt about it. And I do, in my work, I hold myself to an incredibly high standard. Nobody puts more pressure on me than me. But I also you have to be confident enough in yourself to keep going, because journalism is so tough, and like the online stuff is horrendous. So you need to back yourself, because nobody else is going to back you.
I'm amazed, I mean, but not surprised that your father had the foresight to give you that's great advice. That's really sensible advice, you know, and it instills that ability and that confidence in your own ability. And I wonder, I know you're very close to your grandfather, and I believe your grandfather was an orphan?
My granny and granddad were both orphans.
Both orphans. Do you think that information passing down through the family is kind of like, you have to be self-sufficient, you're nearly on your own? No, not quite on your own, but you know, it's not enough to be as good as, you have to be better than.
Aye, and I think as well, I think there's a nice symmetry in that my granddad was adopted out of an ad in the newspaper. So that without newspapers, there would be none of us. But I think a lot of it, and the thing I always took from my family, and that even through the Bloody Sunday Justice campaign, and you know the way you grew up in Derry, is that you're not better than anyone else, and no one else is better than you. So that's the kind of way we were brought up. And like when I came in to even somewhere like Leinster House, and you know the Dáil, and like the politicians, and then a lot of the journalists, not so much now, but previously, are all privately educated. They all come from, you know, very well-off backgrounds. That is changing, and I think that's a good thing, because I really believe that journalism needs a plurality of voices to reflect society. Yeah. But in Dublin, it hasn't always been that way. And I think only through, even when getting into Leinster House, it is daunting. For the first, I would say easily for the first 2 months in Leinster House, I never asked a question at a press conference, because also a lot of people have bother with my accent, and if they ask me to repeat myself, it used to get a bit embarrassing. So I didn't have the confidence to ask a question for the first couple of months. But you just get used to it. It's like everything else. You just power through.
You know, if somebody was telling you about an adoption out of a newspaper as a prelude to a book, you wouldn't buy the book. It's so far-fetched.
I know.
But it's true that, you know, it's just mind-boggling that you think that. And of course, with regard to your accent, I had the privilege of living in Derry, Scéalta, that you know better than me.
Where I hail from.
I was there for about 5 months and found the people just amazing. And I say that someone like you who's travelled and have been around the world and all that, amazing. Glasgow becomes too small for you. There seems to be a pattern. Yeah. Glasgow becomes too small. Mumbai.
I went to Australia.
First?
I lived in Malawi. So, yeah, I decided then when I was at university and I was doing journalism, and I thought I want to be a war correspondent. I want to be a foreign affairs correspondent. And I had said this to one of my tutors, and she said that there's this programme through the British government, the state aid or whatever it is. They send young graduates out to kind of far-flung places to work. And I ended up quite hilariously wanting to be a war correspondent, and got sent to Malawi, which is known as the warm heart of Africa, has never been at war. And I worked there for nearly 6 months, living there with 5 other young people, working for a human trafficking charity. I was a press officer, and then you did 3 or 4 days of the work in the office, and then we would do things like, you know, we were helping give out antiretroviral drugs for people living with HIV, you know, building toilets for primary schools, because the big issue in Malawi is that a lot of schools don't have toilets, and therefore that's a barrier to education for young girls. So did that for about 6 months, and then came back to Glasgow.
And you crusaded and fought battles the whole way through your period, I'm told, by someone who knows of your experience. I don't want to give away too much, because then you'll know who it was.
Protect your sources.
But was it always that you were just not there to mark time, that you were there to fight on behalf of those who needed to fought for?
I know this is going to sound, people are going to be rolling their eyes when they hear me saying this, but I really think the best thing about journalism, the whole point of journalism, is to give a voice to the voiceless. You know, I'm not interested in like just repeating, you know, quotes from politicians and putting it in the paper. I think governments get very, very complacent, and worse, if they are not held to a proper standard, and I think we are seeing that now in Downing Street. I think I went to less parties as a fresher than they have had in Downing Street in lockdown. So for me, that is the main thing, and it doesn't have to be adversarial. I don't go into work in Leinster House every day with like a dartboard with politicians' face on it. I just really believe that everybody has a job to do, and my job is to question the government, to hold power to account, and give a voice to people who wouldn't normally have one. And I do think the reason the kind of moderate success I've had in Leinster House is because a lot of the stories I've done haven't been done before, because there haven't been enough young people, working class people, women in political journalism to tell those stories. And I said this already, but journalism is only going to get better when we all start looking very different.
Well, just let me say this: it's not a moderate success. it's an impressive success. You're an award-winning journalist, and I say that against all the background that you shouldn't even be in the job, never mind get awards, because you don't fit that stereotypical. Is there one thing, or maybe perhaps a number of things that in terms of life experience that you brought back from Africa?
It gives you the maddest sense of perspective. Like, when I came back, in the immediate aftermath of coming back, one funny thing was that I couldn't have hot showers anymore. I found the water was hot coming out of the shower. It was too hot. I was that used to, because you went to a well and got a bucket to wash in. So yeah, and I hadn't had a shower for like 5 months, and when I came back I had to have the water really lukewarm because it was too hot. But I would say the sense of perspective it gives you is mad. Like, when you come back, you do not sweat the small stuff at all. And it's not that thing, it's like, oh, everybody has it worse, but you just genuinely, Malawi's the second poorest country on earth. And you come back with you're so well informed about the level of privilege that you have. So that was the big thing I took away from it. And it's not like you don't go out there and feel sorry for everybody, and it's like not in that patronising way. But it is a completely different world, and you just don't sweat the small stuff anymore because we don't know where we're living.
I had a brother who was a similar project in Africa, and he said when he came home, for him it wasn't the showers, it was the food. He said just when he looked at a plate, which was probably normal what we would consume here, he just, like, if I'd eat all of that, because he was eating what would have fed a family for at a meal time.
Aye.
You grew out of Africa, and head to Australia.
Went to Australia. Australia was class.
What part of Australia were you in?
Melbourne. Went to Australia and didn't want to give up journalism, but didn't know anybody in Melbourne, didn't know the culture, didn't know the politics, didn't know the kind of media landscape. But I was determined, I wasn't going back to work in a pub. I was like, I need to use my degree, because I'd done work, I already had the work done in Glasgow, and I didn't want to waste it. And I applied for anything and everything, and ended up the chief reporter for a magazine about trucks and lorries. Which you knew a whole lot about. You just adapt, you just power through. Even now, if I see a lorry in the street, I could tell you the fucking payload and everything else that it has. I just didn't want to waste the skills I had created or whatever. So yeah, worked as a chief reporter for a truck magazine. And I can't say I loved it, to be honest. But you do it. It was money, and I was in Australia, and I was playing GAA over there, and loads of friends. And at the time of my life, I loved it, and the job was kind of secondary because the lifestyle was good and it was still journalism. And then I started freelancing in my spare time at the Irish Echo, the newspaper over there, and I interviewed Daniel O'Donnell, just peak of my career, and did that. I was there 2 years and then came back to Glasgow then. Was there an attraction, or was there not an attraction to stay in Australia? It's hard to explain. It's too far away for starters, and when I was out there in my second year, my granny died unexpectedly, and I had to fly home, and I think I was a bit traumatised by the whole experience. And then after I came back after the funeral and stuff, heart wasn't in it anymore then. I just said, oh no, I just want to come home. You're just too far away. But the lifestyle and the weather and there's a reason everybody goes and stays because it's amazing. Reading stuff about you and reading kind of up-to-date information and interviews that you'd give, for me anyway, and maybe I prejudged this, but it became kind of clear you were always coming home. I mean, whatever else was going on, that you were coming home. Aye. So back to Glasgow again? Back to Glasgow, was at the Daily Record for about 6 months, and then David Young, who is the Ireland editor for Press Association, contacted me and said, we are looking for someone in Dublin, and I just says, I'll bite your hand off, no bother. And I went, that was 4 or 5 years ago, and haven't looked back since, been in Dublin since.
I know that you're quite, I don't want to use the word outspoken because you're not outspoken, but I know you're quite opinionating about, you've mentioned it already in this interview, that what journalists need to do is not report on society but reflect society, and you argue for women's participation, working class participation. You know, there's a world outside of Belfast, believe it or not, and Belfast people don't always know
have
that.
been trying to tell you that for a long time, but you aren't listening.
I just as Africa informed you, Derry informed me. I can do a number of Derry accents and Derry words just to confuse people. But did Glasgow, and did that political reporting in Glasgow, did it travel to Ireland? Did it have any effect on you?
I covered the Scottish independence referendum when I was there, and the newspaper that I worked for was a local regional paper, Clydebank, so it's just outside Glasgow, Clydebank Post and a Dumbarton Reporter. Clydebank was a shipbuilding town, and all the shipyards closed. Really, really, really deprived area now, you know, massive issues with heroin, massive heroin issues, not as bad as it was. The people are absolutely great, you'll never meet better people. But I covered the Scottish independence referendum, and it became very clear to me when I was there that it was the people who had been left behind by society, who were hungry for change, who were voting for Scottish independence. It was not a surprise when the votes started coming in that the most deprived areas in Scotland were the areas that voted for Scottish independence, and the more wealthy, more affluent areas voted to stay in the United Kingdom. And I think that, to me, for all the difference in politics and the green and orange that we have in the north, I have found now that the green and orange thing is a conversation for 30 years ago, because the actual bread and butter issues now are what people care about. And it was the same during the independence referendum. People didn't want to talk about whether they would keep Flower of Scotland as the anthem or whether they were going to keep the Scéalta as a flag. People wanted to know about their pensions, they wanted to know about the NHS, they wanted to know about housing, all those sorts of things. And that's something that I have really taken away. And even now when I'm working in Dublin and in Belfast, and there's all this talk about a united Ireland, and I have no interest in the kind of cultural conversation about it, because realistically people have been left behind by the peace process, like people have been left behind in Scotland after Thatcher's reign. And I think that's something I really took away. I see a symmetry in that now. Yeah.
There's a great quotation at I'm assuming it's accurate, where you were addressing the conference and you said, "I've no interest in flags or symbols. What I want to know is about people. I want to know, is it good for people, bad for people, or can it get good?" So is that a driving force within your own head, your skills, your talent?
Like, I did a talk on Saturday, that Ireland's future thing, and I didn't really think about it. I'd said yes, and then didn't really think about it. And it was only when I got there I kind of realised I don't know what I think about United Ireland. I thought I probably should have given this more thought before I got here. But as I said, you know, I know there has a conversation to be had about the cultural issues, but that's not what people care about. And the thing is, you could be the most die-hard nationalist Republican that you could meet, but people want certainty. This island has had so much uncertainty for the last 30, 40, 50 years. People want to know what the future is going to look like. Sure. And for most people, they are not willing to step into the breach for just to say, I live in a united Ireland. Because if your life is going to be worse, people aren't going to want to do it. So I think I'm very into, you know, social justice issues, and I am a bit different, and I think that's why the Examiner does well in our politics team, is that we all have a kind of niche that we're into. Like, I don't write the same stories as my boss, Danny McConnell, but we don't come from the same sort of background, and we're not interested in the same things. And I think that's why journalism is better when everyone is different. And I think being northern, you have a very different perspective. You know, some of the things they write about in Leinster House, I'd be laughing away to myself, being like, lads, you only think you have problems.
Yeah, what do I tell you? I have to say again, because you're quite modest in your opinions, I mean, there's a sprinkling of talent in the paper as well. Like it's not just simply that you just have a different. The McKee shooting in Derry, I know had a big effect on you. So tell me, not tell me why, but try and explain to me what it affected you. I
was absolutely heartbroken over Lyra McKee's murder. I didn't know Lyra. I know her girlfriend, Sarah. She's an amazing person, but I was in Dublin at the time on the Thursday night, and obviously the riots had started, and my major concern at the time was the riots started in a street in Craigan after a house was raided. The house that was raided is next door to my auntie, who is a widow who lives alone. So immediately my first concern was finding where she was. Being the Derry woman that she is, she wasn't in because she was at a wake. So I said to her, stay where you are, don't go up to the house, it's all kicked off, and then you're getting sent all the videos on WhatsApp of the riots and this, that and the other, and then I was, talking to work, and we were working the whole night trying to cover it, and we had sent a photographer up and all this, and then the next thing I had heard that someone had been shot, a girl had been shot. Initially we had heard it was a really young teenager, and it really, really broke my heart because that's not my Derry. That's not what happens in Derry anymore. And I felt like we had just jumped back 30 years. And it was also like there's probably a selfish kind of personal thing out of it of like me and Lyra were the same age. We had the same kind of job. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She wasn't there working. She was there watching a riot. And also it happened in Craigan. My ma's from Craigan, my granny's from Craigan. I was half reared in Craigan. And then there was this kind of, I felt this weird sense of, you felt like you had to defend the estate. No, we're not all like that. That's not what Craigan's like. Craigan has a lot of problems. There's a high rate of poverty, high rate of child poverty in Craigan, but they're the best people in the world. And then I was on the defensive then, running around talking. I did BBC World Service. I did a million interviews saying these people do not represent us. But I also was trying to point out that there are a community, and they are usually young men who are attracted or groomed or whatever it is by paramilitary violence because they don't have any opportunities. If you're out rioting, the people who are out rioting on a Sunday night are not people who are getting up to go to work on a Monday morning. And that was the other issue. It was like, this doesn't reflect us, but there are socioeconomic issues that lead to this happening, and we need to discuss them as well.
I remember distinctly seeing you nearly on every news, right across all the channels, and I had just began to read your column, so I didn't really know who you were. I knew what you had written, but I didn't know who you were. But the interview struck me that this is somebody who cares. It isn't somebody who's reporting, and I then put it down to the fact that it could have been you. This could have been me. And then the other things that you mentioned, that this is not Derry, this is not the people of Derry, this is, no matter how big of a tragedy it is, this is not us. For many people, and as I said earlier on, I had the privilege of living in Derry for a while and enjoyed it, I have to say, and I go to Derry fairly regular. And Emer was in Derry for a weekend and we couldn't get her back home again.
Lucky you.
So, Derry girls, for a lot of people is introduced, even though it's a period piece rather than that. But I'll tell you what it's introduced to Belfast. Belfast people let you into a secret. Belfast people think they're the only people in the world that have a sense of humour. and anybody that thinks that hasn't been to Derry. The Derry sense of humour will get you through anything.
Aye. It's so dark.
Oh, it's so good.
There is nothing that there's nothing that we won't take the piss out of.
It's so good.
But I would say, I'm not like the biggest Derry Girls fan in the world, but it is very nice to have something about the town that people are very proud of.
Yeah.
That opened up an English audience, because the Troubles were horrific, and it's not that the show makes light of the Troubles, but people lived their everyday lives during a time of war, and there is comedy in that. When it first, I don't even know if I should say this, when it first started, a number of people text me, because that's the school I went to. The school that Derry Girls is based on is the school I went to, the convent. Yeah. And so a number of people text me saying, Michelle out of Derry Girls
looks like you.
That's the way you acted at school. Like a total mad woman. And but it's the Derry humour. But I love, especially for English audiences and people who would have very little knowledge of the Troubles, it is so good to have something, because, you know, like when I went to Glasgow when I was 18, people used to genuinely ask me, how far away is Derry from Londonderry? And I had to sit there and be like, oh my God, I'm going to sit and explain this now to people. So it is nice that we have a lot to be proud of in Derry, but it's just
absolutely
nice.
Well, and one of the things, and I'll pass on this, one of the things I think for people, the dialogue is absolutely fantastic. But the sense of how to use vocabulary that Derry people have is brilliant. It's really brilliant.
And like, I would say that, you know, I've had ex-boyfriends or whatever who I was in Dublin and Glasgow or whatever.
Get rid of them.
And they always say Derry people have their own language. Like,
oh, of course, yeah.
The last trail that I went out with, like, we needed a translator, like trying to have a conversation, because we do have our own vernacular, and it is a kind of Hiberno English type thing. But some of the phrases, like some of the things even my granny used to come out with, and also the thing in Derry is everybody talks to everybody. Like, I was getting out of the car the other day to get petrol, and a man in his 50s came up to me and says, where'd you get your boots? Just a total stranger. And I was like, oh, I got them in office, blah blah blah, chatting away. There's nobody. Like, I always mind my ma walking. We were walking down Shipty Street, and there was a boutique, you know, with a mannequin with this big coat on it. It had a tag on it, so £500 this coat. And there was a woman looking in the window, and she looked at my mommy, total strangers passing. She goes, would you ever? My mum went, never. And they just walked on. But it's that type of sort of closeness, social, friendly, everybody talks to everybody.
I think it's small enough to be a town and big enough to be a city. And I think part of it is that kind of familiar.
It's a village. It's a city that acts like a village.
Okay. You can say that. If I say that.
I was actually talking to somebody about this the other day, and I said, all the things I love about Derry are the things I hate about Derry. Like, everybody knows your business. Yeah. Everybody knows everybody. You can do nothing in Derry, but people find out about it. But that's what I like about it as well. And that comes from that kind of working class resolve. You know, Susan McKay, a friend of mine, she's from Drumahoe, Presbyterian Unionist background, and she said she always used to be so jealous of the sense of community in the nationalist community in Derry. She said it wasn't something she ever grew up with. But I do think it comes from, you know, that kind of downtrodden thing of like, everybody's having a hard time, so I'll give you a hand up. And I think that's a testament to Derry. They probably shouldn't have ever had to be that way. No. But they are, and I think it's the best thing about it. Sometimes
when you don't have anything but your humour, you make the best of it. And by God, the Derry people have made the best of it.
And we make such an outsized sort of contribution to the world. Like, it is mad sometimes when you think about how many or how far Derry people have gone. Yeah. Like, and like for how all the size of it. But it is to do with the kind of, I don't want to say eccentric.
What you can say, I can't.
But there is a certain type of like quirky madness that comes out of Derry people, and I think that's why maybe we do so well.
And thankfully that's the case. You talked about journalism and the changes it's gone through, not necessarily the telecommunication type changes, but just the changes in who are journalists and how they are. And you have never shied away from that demand or request or advice that it should reflect all of us. Has it ever got you into soapy water or hot water or whatever the proper expression is? Has it ever kind of left you outside of the journalistic pack?
Well, we call it the Leinster House bubble. So the way it works, and I'm sure this is the same, I actually think they have a different name for it in England. It's called the Westminster Village or something like that, but it's the same thing. So basically the only way I can describe it is you're in Leinster House, you're all on the same four walls, and there'll be an argument about something, right? And your entire day is dominated by this argument, this political argument. The canteen ladies are talking about it, your boss is talking about it, everyone's talking about it, right? And this is the biggest thing in the world this day, and you could walk out of Leinster House, walk down Kildare Street and meet a normal civilian person and say, did you hear about this? And they'll say, no, what are you talking about?
No interest.
Because you're in a bubble.
Yeah.
And because everyone's talking, it's like an echo chamber in a way, that like everyone's talking about the same thing, and you have to try and keep a sense of perspective that most day-to-day people are not worried about this issue, whatever the issue may be. And I would also say, and like I told my boss this when he hired me in my job interview, I said, listen, I don't think I'm ever going to be fully in the Leinster House bubble. I don't feel like my background allows for it. And I would say, and this is not a criticism of the people themselves, but a lot of politicians in Leinster House are older men from rural communities. So when I phone them with my accent and at my age, they're not going to spill their guts to me, which is totally fair enough. You know what I mean? We don't, you know, you have to build up trust with your sources and stuff like this. Yeah. I have found that I have much better relationships with younger TDs, female TDs, people from different kind of backgrounds, but the bulwark is the older men, the middle class men from the rural communities, you know. So I do have a harder time than, say, my boss would have, trying to get people to tell me stuff. But then, you know, there's people in there who would tell me stuff and won't tell him. You know, everybody has their own set of skills, everybody has their own kind of way of doing the job. So at times it does bother me. Like, I know there's certain, like, I could phone somebody and they'll say, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And my boss will phone them 10 minutes later and they'll tell them everything he needs to know. And it does bother you. But then that's the job as well. Not everybody's going to like you, not everybody's going to trust you. And I do think some people, not all of them, because I have very good relationships with even, you know, politicians I have nothing in common with, or some of the biggest gentlemen you'll ever meet in your life. But I do find some of them do probably find me a bit disagreeable. I think in general, women who say what they think are often found a bit disagreeable, and I think Alison Morris and Susan McKay and all those women could probably testify to that as well. But yeah, it is not the norm. Most people in our Leinster House, I have to say, no matter what the party, are incredibly polite and easy to work with.
I really, having read about you and having read your column and meeting you now for the first time, I can't see you wanting to be in anybody's bubble. I think it'd be a cue wanting to be in your bubble, but I really can't see it working in reverse. I think the days when, and you mentioned journalists who have broken through that glass ceiling, or if they're not broken through it, they're kicking at it. I think the days that, you know, you had to be a Guinness drinker, like whiskey, smoke a pipe, play golf and do all of that. I fit all the criteria of that. I think that those days are rapidly going, thankfully.
I've been in Leinster House 3-4 years now, and I've even noticed in the 4 years I've been there a shift. You know, a lot more young journalists, a lot more female journalists. I was at a press conference for the Taoiseach during the summer, and there was 10 of us there, and 8 of us were women. Good. Which is unheard of. Great. I was delighted. I'm sure the Taoiseach wasn't, because the questions come thick and fast when it's women. But that's a really good thing. Now, I would say in Leinster House, when it comes to the press corps, it is still dominated by men, but it is changing. You know, people from different backgrounds, like for instance, my great friend of mine, Ciara Phelan, she's from a really rural community in Carlow. She goes on the radio or she goes on the TV, and immediately she's slagged off for the way she talks, because she has a very broad Carlow accent and stuff. But what these people need to remember is that we're not going anywhere. And we won't go anywhere, and people just need to get used to it. And people hate change. You know, people are used to having their news told to them by a certain type of person, and there will be, you know, a transition period. But a lot more people now are more interested in a plurality of voices, and I think that's what makes journalism much better.
Again, just to quote somebody who I won't name, they were talking about your energy, and they just were describing like a locomotive. You know? She just goes. And they were saying they were with you, or talking about something, but and they looked and you were away, and where did you go? Was lockdown difficult for you?
Oh, I hated it.
I knew that, but I had to ask the question.
Yeah, I didn't do well in lockdown at all. I'm a really social person as it is. Journalism is a really social job. You need to be in front of people. You need to get in their faces.
Love people.
I love people.
Yeah.
Your best stories are not from press releases. Your best stories are from bumping into somebody outside the canteen. This is Woody here. Have you heard about this? In lockdown.
Don't tell anybody, but let me tell you.
In lockdown, there was none of that. You bumped into nobody. Leinster House was like a ghost town. And then you have masks on, your social distance. You can't whisper about a scandal when you have a mask on and you have to be 6 feet away from somebody. The other issue was, in lockdown, if you phone a politician, they don't have to answer the phone.
Yeah, that's it.
But if you bump into them in the corridor, they can't run away from you. Yeah. So I found it really hard. I think a lot of people, like I only started in the Examiner as a full-time political correspondent in the February. We went on the lockdown in the March. There was programme for government negotiations, coalition negotiations. A lot of the people involved in that were politicians who had been around for a very long time, who didn't know me and I didn't know them. So I found it really difficult. I was nearly banging my head off a wall some nights. I've only started the job and I was afraid to go back to my editor and say, I don't have anything. But you power through, like you just get creative. What I used to do during programme for government is if they wouldn't answer the phone, I used to text them just saying, I heard this, is this true? And I'd get a yes or a no, so at least then, and I was completely guessing a lot of the time. But you get creative, you work your way around it, and then the longer you're in there, it's like everything else, you get to know people and you build up your sources and all that. But lockdown was a nightmare. I remember I used to go to the Department of Health press conferences, they give out the case numbers and all that, and I used to feel so lucky that I was getting out of the house, because I was living with my boyfriend at the time and my brother and his girlfriend. There's 4 of us in a 2-bedroom flat in Coolock. They were all working from home. We were all ready for the hills, and it's like, it's not anybody's fault, but you're in close quarters all the time, and we weren't even allowed 2 kilometres from our house.
When you're back at the gym, you're back running. That's what I'm told anyway. We're nearly out of time. You'll be surprised to hear, because we've been talking for almost an hour.
This went very quick.
Plans for the future?
Somebody asked me, I did Other Voices in November too, and they asked me what your plan is for the future, and I was like, I didn't plan on any of this, so don't really have a plan. I'm writing a book, so the book is... The book is the biggest thing I've ever taken on. As I said earlier, I hold myself to an incredibly high standard, and the subject matter of the book is incredibly divisive. It's a book about modern Sinn Féin, so I don't think there's anybody on this island who doesn't have an opinion about modern Sinn Féin. And I know, and I need to take a lot of this in, but there are some people who are going to hate this book no matter what I write in the book.
Fine.
So I need to kind of, accept that or whatever. But the book is the main thing. I try not to think that far ahead because I would start panicking. So I don't think about the book in its totality. I try and think of it in chapters or whatever.
Sure.
I always kind of knew I would write a book. I always just sort of felt I would write a book. I didn't think I would write it about Sinn Féin, but I always thought I would write a book. So I want to get that over me. But other than that, long term, I have no idea. I just take everything as it comes, say yes to everything.
Well, let me let you into a secret before we finish. We haven't seen nothing yet. I think that in terms of your talent, in terms of your energy, in terms of all of that, we're going to see books, we're going to see television, we're going to see documentaries, and we're going to see radio. So I think all of that is the way for you.
I think I would quite like to get into documentary film. I can be a big fan of Trevor McBurney and all that. And I think documentaries are... Well,
if you're ever stuck for a subject matter, I'll slip you my number and you just ring me.
No bother, we could do one about in here.
We could, of course. For being a wonderful guest and for taking the time, and you've travelled and I know you're busy and all of that. Can I thank you?
Thank you.
And I'm waiting for the next instalment.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.